So yesterday was the 20th anniversary of me switching over to primarily John Deere equipment. 10/3 of 2003, I bought my first John Deere 4450, my first John Deere tractor. Technically, it wasn't my first John Deere tractor. I had a John Deere A when I was a kid, but this was the first tractor that I had bought farming full-time by myself that was a John Deere. So I grew up either farming around home or helping the neighbor out the other half of my childhood. And they had both red and green, and my dad was an International guy, but my grandpa was a John Deere guy, but just like two cylinders. He loved two cylinders. But growing up, since Dad had red tractors, I, for the most part, was an International guy. Well, I started farming on my own at 21. And when I was 24 years old, I was able to just full-time farm. Before that, I had worked hauling heavy equipment and was a diesel mechanic, and then I farmed too. But when I was 24, I went full-time farming. And I had my own farm. I had bought my own farm. And I was milking 50 cows. And my tractors at the time were my 856, and then I had two 1466s. One was an open station, and one was a black stripe with a cab. And the black stripe with the cab was my big tractor. It pulled my chopper, which happened to be a John Deere 3950, and it would do my main tillage and stuff. But chopping was a lot of that workload for that tractor because I chopped just about all the feed. I would small square bale a little bit, but haylage and corn silage, that was the tractor. Now, having 50 cows by myself, I spent a lot of time choring. So when I would do field work, a lot of times it was like late at night or even, rushed during the day, but wasn't very comfortable sitting in that 1466. It just wasn't, especially late at night. Didn't have great lighting. This is before LEDs and stuff. You had the black plastic halogens, which would just about melt because they'd get so untouchably hot. But I wanted something better. And the chopper was kind of a problem for that 1466. The IHs didn't have very good hydraulics to run the electric over hydraulic controls on a John Deere chopper, and it just didn't perform as well with an IH tractor, even if you ran the open center kit. So I dreamed of having a nice cab tractor. The issue was I was a young guy, plenty of debt, had my own farm. Milk prices were terrible. Milk prices were $10 milk. And I was getting by. I was making my payments. But I remember I'm like, I really need a nice tractor, something with a good cab and that. And I said to my banker, he goes, I tell you what, you make it a full year of full-time farming, not just farming, full-time farming, and you don't have to come to me for anything. He goes, I'll give you a loan to buy a nice tractor. So that was the fall of 2002 that he had told me that. In the summer of 2003, on Sundays sometimes, Sunday night, I would have somebody milk for me Sunday night. That's the only milking I got off. I would take my pickup and I'd go look at equipment. And a lot of times I would go down to Duran Implement in Duran, Wisconsin, and they had a 4440 sitting there. And I don't know how many times I went down there and just sat in the cab of that 4440. I was like, oh, this would be so nice. I was a red tractor guy. So why the 4440? Well, growing up, I always wanted a 4440. Some of you guys look at a Soundgarden and think, oh, they're just terrible nowadays. But growing up, that was the nicest cab when I was a kid. And when somebody had a 4440, you were like, wow, that is a farm. However, I was a red tractor guy. So when it finally made it to the year it had been, I remember we got done with corn silage. It was hot weather that fall, and it was just everything that 14 had to get done with chopping. I remember I called the banker and I said, hey, it's been a year. And he goes, for what? And I go, I can go tractor shopping. So my budget was $20,000. And I was thinking either 88 series or a boxcar Magnum. Believe it or not, you could buy those tractors back then for 20 grand. They were around. Closed center hydraulics worked with that John Deere chopper good. And the PFC 86 series just wasn't something I really wanted to buy. So our equipment down in Dodgeville, Wisconsin had a 7130 two-wheel drive. And I can't remember, but I think it was like $19,950 they wanted for it. I think it had duals. And at the time, this tractor was at the oldest 16 years old. And it could have been as new as, 11 years old or something like that, or 10 years old. But it was an earlier Magnum. Still, I mean, you look at now, that was cheap. And it had probably 8,000 some hours on it. And I remember I went down and looked at it, I drove it, and I'm like, well, this is great. But here was the problem. I had a John Deere 1219 Haybine at the time, and it was one of the nicest pieces of equipment I owned. So I wasn't in the market to get rid of that 1219 Haybine. And we would try and cut, or I would try and cut all my hay at one time. So I would go around the clock at night and everything else cutting hay. So if I was getting a nice cab tractor, I wanted to be able to cut hay with that tractor. And when you hook a 1219 Haybine to that 7130 Magnum, you can't see it behind the back of the tractor hardly. You know, with the drawbar position and the size of a Magnum, it just wasn't going to be, good on that Haybine, little 9-foot Haybine. But it was a lot nicer than that 1466. So I'm thinking about it, and I look over, and he also had a 4440 there. And I walk over to this 4440, and the first thing I noticed, it had a 4630 engine in it. It wasn't a 4440 engine. Be a 404 versus a 466. The 404 intercooled versus a 466. And then I noticed it was missing some cab glass. And I went and I looked at it, and I'm like, I still love this cab. And this would be a lot handier tractor than that Magnum. So I asked the guy, I'm like, well, how much for that 4440 out there? And he goes, $16,900. And I go, $16,900. I go, it's got, it's got a 4630 engine in it. It's missing cab glass. I'm like, you only want like $19,900 for that Magnum over there. And he's like, oh no. He's like, I could sell as many 4440s as I can get. He goes, that thing will be gone within a day or two. Well, that made me stop and think. So I didn't take that Magnum right away. I was like, let me think about it. And it might have been $20,900, but it was right around the $20,000 mark. Maybe it was $19,900, I think, or maybe he went down to that. But either way, they had it approved like through Ag Direct or whatever Farm Credit had, And I'm like, I got to think about it. And I went back home, and there was a New Holland dealer right in town, and they were connected to the John Deere dealer group. And I was like going to talk to the salesman, and I said, hey, Tom, I go, I'm looking at the 7130 Magnum. I go, I like it, but do you guys got anything else in that horsepower range I could use? And something with a nice cab. And I knew he'd talk about that 4440 for one thing. So I'm like, yep, I know about that 4440, Tom. And he rattled off a couple other tractors, and then he goes, hey, down in Arcadia, Wisconsin, he goes, they got a 4450. And I'm like, well, that's probably too much money. Well, between the dairy prices being bad and crop prices being bad, they weren't selling a lot of equipment. So they actually had an ad that they took out in the country today. There was a newspaper for MDMA. That was the dealership group, the John Deere dealership group, with their one New Holland, or I guess Mondovi also sold New Holland. But they took out an ad saying, we have all this equipment to sell, make an offer. And it listed the price that they were asking, and it said, make an offer. And that 4440 and the 4450 were both on there. And he goes, well, let's make an offer. So this is a part 2 video.